Hi everyone, welcome to the Wheel of Mind, the Wheel of Time point of view reread podcast. This season we've been reading Matt Cawthon's perspective. Welcome to Season 2, Episode 22, where after a long recovery during Path of Daggers, we're here to talk about Matt's debut in Winter's Heart. I'm your co-host, Lajar Dane of the White Aja.
Hi, and I'm Giskel Semerus, a scholar from Ilion. I do want to give a quick thank you to all of our loyal listeners and a friendly warning to any new listeners. We may drop spoilers at any time during this podcast without any further warning, so please read the entire series before listening to The Wheel of Mind.
Today we're covering chapters 15 and 16 from Winter's Heart, and I'll get us started with a summary of chapter 15, In Need of a Bell Founder. Matt is sitting in Eludra's workshop, apparently still in Ebudar, after the Seanchan invasion that began back in A Crown of Swords before the whole wall fell on him, and that's the last we saw of him. Matt is equally mesmerized both by Eludra's preparation processes for the fireworks and by her attractiveness. He's turning on the charm and asking for the secrets to her fireworks, but she refuses. And we get the sense that this is an old argument. But Matt assures her that she has nothing to fear, that she won't run into any other guild members. He thought he was being subtle about why, but she squeezes the why out of him all the same. The only remaining Illuminators Guild chapter house, it turns out, was destroyed and the people inside enslaved when the Seanchan invaded Tanchico. Eludra is understandably upset at the news and wonders aloud, what would Matt want with the fireworks anyway, to hurl at the Seanchan in revenge? Well, of course, Matt insists, and he shares his plan for weaponizing the night flowers. Eludra herself has been thinking of this for some time. This is not her first rodeo, and she concedes that she'll share all her secrets with Matt, fireworks and otherwise, some that might even make him blush to boot, if he can correctly guess why she would need a bell founder. Stumped at the riddle, Matt leaves to walk out some of the pain in his hip and leg, with a compliment to his bottom from Eludra on the way out, no doubt due to the short coats and tight breeches that Tylan hasn't dressed in. As Matt wanders outside Eludra's wagon, the reader discovers that the two of them are in none other than Vela and Luca's traveling show that we thought we'd left behind way back in the Fires of Heaven. Luca seems to have done well in the meantime, now able to boast a much larger coterie of performers and even more extravagant clothing and wagon paint jobs than when we last saw him. He's flourishing under the Seanchan Forerunner's rule and the High Lady Suroth's good graces, because he had sheltered a Seanchan animal trainer, Sarandon, the shredded handler that we met back when we were with Nynaeve and Elaine a few books ago. We catch up as well with Tom and Beslin, who seem to be doing well. Oliver is flirting with more women than he knows what to do with, and apparently also getting lessons in music, juggling, sword fighting, and who knows what else. Everyone but Matt is a bad influence on him, of course, Matt notes, and he admonishes a stunned Oliver to be reserved and shy around women. Just then, Valen Luca loudly announces that he's having an important meeting with the High Lady Suroth, and Matt takes the opportunity to question Tom about their plans. Turns out Luca will let them travel with them when they leave for Ebudar, with a heavy price, though. The only other option is to wait until spring, which Matt finds unacceptable. He's really sick of being at Ebudar. He's going to have to do some gambling to come up with that money, and Beslin doesn't seem happy about being complicit in helping his mother's pretty escape. And then the dice start tumbling in his head again. Thus ends Chapter 15, In Need of a Bell Founder.
It's one of those chapters I've really looked forward to because it's one I remembered very clearly from my first read through. I had forgotten that it was the first time Matt is reintroduced. He's been gone for an entire book and been AWOL and MIA for an entire book, but the first time we were reintroduced to him, and he's talking to Eludra about a bell founder, and he is bumfuzzled, which is an old Seanchan word. I'm sorry to use that, but Matt has no idea how a bell founder can have anything to do with fireworks. What in the world can that mean? How can that have anything to do with it? And everybody else, all the readers in the world, look at it and they gasp. They're about to invent cannons, and you see this coming. And I don't know why. He had a hard time going from a paper tube to a long elongated bell, brass or steel tube in order to launch these. But yeah, for some reason he just couldn't make that mental stretch, but Eludra could. So it's one of these things that's tantalizing. It has you aching for the characters to put these pieces together, but we go on quite a while before this particular thing comes together in the story. But it's one of those I find fascinating and fun. You wonder why Illuminators had not built things like this years before, because surely Eludra was not the first person to consider this or to think about using the fireworks as a weapon. But for whatever reason, yeah, she's the first, and it's a fun part of the story. I'm really looking forward to seeing more interactions between Matt and Eludra in the future.
Yeah.
Really?
I think that there may be historical analogs to the very secretive Illuminators Guild that purposely keeps those things under wraps. So I know that I've heard, at least from other podcasts and stuff, that making lenses and mirrors and stuff like that was one of those trades that was very tightly controlled and secretive during, I'm thinking maybe the Middle Ages or kind of a Renaissance period, maybe sort of like the tech that many of our Randlanders are at this point. I think that fireworks were around a lot longer than using the same substances as a weapon, too. So I believe that fireworks were invented in ancient China, but they didn't have guns with them or anything like that, and didn't have cannons with them. So it may just have something to do with the secrecy of making the process, that these guilds are very careful not to let this stuff become weaponized, or not to let anybody else get their hands on it, so that they could do something else with it. I'm not really sure. I would have to do some more research about that, but I just imagine that. So I just wonder if this is analogous to history. But I like that this is our first time spending any time with Eludra since Matt rescued her. I think the girls just vaguely mentioned her in the Fires of Heaven.
Right.
That she was in the circus at the time. I know they're not calling it a circus, the menagerie, or Valen Lucas Traveling Show, or whatever he's calling it now. I like that when she's reintroduced, we immediately see how competent she is. And all we had really seen of her before was just her berating Tammuz, guild members trying to kill her. But now we're seeing that she is competent enough. She has thought about exactly how she would weaponize fireworks. Not just that, oh, I bet you could knock these over and blow stuff up with it, like happened to the chapter house in Kyrian when she was there. But she has thought about which professionals she would contact to make the equipment that she needs. Once Matt works all this out later, she has a shopping list for him. And so it's just really cool seeing her engineering skills, I guess you could say. It probably looks a little more like alchemy to our characters, a little more mysterious than that.
I had not thought of the word alchemy, but yeah, very much she is. Well, like the word competent they used near the beginning, it describes her perfectly. She knows exactly what she's doing. She knows how to be careful with it. Yes, a lot of times the mortar and pestle, they'll be wood. There's a lot of research that went into this. You don't use anything that can create a spark. So yeah, there's so many little details that fit in so perfectly in this part of the story, and I like that about her. She is a very careful person, a very good at her craft, and I like that about her. I was a little surprised that she would let Matt flirt with her that much, but even put his arm around her. He's really laying on the charm as thickly as he can, and it just seems like she does not want to put up with his foolishness. But then he talks about when he would get her distracted with kisses. I guess she's human too, and Matt must be fairly cute, or at least he thinks he is. So
yeah. I think she's having a good time stringing him along. I mean, he's so curious about the fireworks in the first place that she can just kind of easily lord that over him. But the fact that she does seem to find him attractive on top of that, it's just got to be sort of a game for her. She sort of seems to be playing like, I'm too busy, I don't need you bugging me. But then she pinches his bottom and stuff like that, or compliments it. And so I really enjoy their flirting because it seems like they're both into it, but they're both being really circumspect about what they want. And I don't know, it's just some of the more fun flirting and romantic scenes in this series. That's not always Robert Jordan's strong suit, but I feel like this feels really organic and also just kind of fun. And then some of the stuff with Tuon in the way that Matt feels later on when he develops this kind of friendship that seems to develop into love for her. Now, whether she feels anything the same way is a whole another matter, but that feels very organic to me. the walks that they take together, them playing stones together and all that kind of stuff. And so I feel like maybe he hit a stride with that somewhere in these later books. And I'm interested to see more of that. But I just really love the scene here.
Oh, yeah, me too. And you really have to respect Eludra in the fact that she understands a lot about Matrim Cauthon as a person. She's dialed in on who he is. She knows she cannot trust him with too much information right now, because he will do something crazy with it. He will try to drive the Seanchan out with a handful of firecrackers or something. Yeah, I just find that cool that she knows how to restrain his ambition toward the fireworks. She knows they can be used for weapons. She's already had this idea. He's had the idea. I think she's intrigued by his inventiveness. Just by the fact of talking about, laying down one of the tubes and firing it, I bet it would go 1,000 paces. So he's already thought about the trajectories, all of that, and she seems surprised that he's that accurate with it.
She does. She seems like she's trying to hide how impressed she is. She's like, oh yeah, well, but I definitely have thought of that a long time ago. Right. But I think inwardly she's like, oh yeah, I think it would. Yeah, you did that math really quick there.
Yes, that was the sense I got as well. But as well, just you cannot trust him with too much information, because he will run off half-cocked, so to speak, and that's not what you need to do with fireworks. That's not what you need to do with gunpowder weapons. You need to have a well-thought-out plan, because as powerful as these dragons, as they call them, will become, and is a wonderful part of the last battle that they are, it's something you have to be prepared to have the men who are trained. You have to be prepared to defend them, because you cannot move them as quickly as you can, men on horseback. And so there's a lot involved in it. You don't just rush out there and let the enemy get your secrets and capture your weapons. So, it's not as mobile as just the paper lunch tubes with the night flowers as Matt is picturing. Because Eludra, they're picturing the same thing, but Eludra has gone bigger with it. She's gone larger, several steps ahead of him. And, and like I said, the result is awesome, but it's just, she's able to restrain him until they can restrain his ambition until they can get to the point that they can do this correctly. And I like that about her, that even with the flirting, even with being impressed with his mental gymnastics to come up with this idea, she's not going to blurt out anything that she doesn't have to. Just keep tantalizing him with a few secrets, a few tidbits here and there. Keep him interested. Get what you want out of it, Eludra, but then, hold him back until it's ready to do it right.
Something else that this scene shows, and it ties into a couple of other Matt classics that show up as well in this chapter, is his usual lack of self-awareness. So when he's talking to Eludra and she's like, what do you mean? Why would I not bump into any more guild members? Do you have something you're trying to tell me? He thought he was being so subtle without trying to break this awful news about the chapter house in Tanchico. You just gotta imagine that he was being very obvious about everything. That he thought he was being incredibly subtle about why he might want to get these secrets out of her, other than just idle curiosity. He thought he was doing a good job of changing the subject or of talking around this bad news that might upset her. And so it's just Matt's usual lack of self-awareness. He doesn't know that he's being incredibly obvious with all of his body language and everything for the most part. And he has another instance of this later in the chapter that's funnier. And usually that's what makes Matt's perspective so funny. The fact that he doesn't like Vale and Luca. The fact that they don't get along because they're too much alike. The reasons that Matt cites in his perspective for his dislike for the man is how he smirks at every woman in sight, and immediately they just dislike each other because they're both checking out all the women, I guess. We also see Oliver's shock at this. Oliver can see this dramatic irony and lack of self-awareness on Matt's part when Oliver's flirting with all the girls and Matt pulls him aside and he's like, you gotta be shy, you gotta be a little timid, they don't like you being so bold and everything. And Oliver is just staring at him like, what are you talking about? Who are you to say this? Yes. And it's just Matt's self-awareness strikes again. Yeah. Right. He has no sense that when he's talking to Oliver like this, he's saying, do as I say, not as I do. It's just the irony's totally lost on him, as usual.
Right. Well, a little bit serious here, we picture ourselves differently internally than than we really present ourselves to the world. So other people see us differently oftentimes than we see ourselves. Now, in Matt's case, as you said, Robert Jordan has taken that and turned it up to 11. And it's so blatant and so out there, and it just creates so much dramatic irony. I mean, you cannot help but just stop and laugh many of the times in these situations where everyone sees it except Matt. And for someone who is so perceptive about everyone else and their motivations when he desires to be, he is just completely oblivious to himself and how he presents himself to the world. So how Matram Coffin thinks he presents himself to the world and how he really does it is two very, very different people. In fact, those people have never met. They're walking in opposite directions.
Yes. In that way, he's extremely similar to Nynaeve, too. They both have so much of that not knowing how they're coming off to other people and saying a lot of things as far as the advice they give other people that seems hypocritical. And it's usually played for laughs. And that's what makes both of their perspectives so funny to be in. They also have this interesting parallel in that both of their character developments are very slow. They are characters who many first-time readers don't like for many books at a time. I mean, Matt is Dagger Matt for so long, and then he just seems kind of immature. And, you know, some people were excited to get that first Matt POV and be like, wow, this is a whirlwind. This is really different. But I still see a lot of people who are going into book 4 or 5, and they're like, does Matt get better? And people often say that about Nynaeve. They're like, she's just angry. Like, she's just kind of mean. Is there anything else going on there? We have some evidence of his slow character development here. We've been seeing bits and bits of it as we go along, and it's happening so close to the same time that we get some of Nynaeve's development as well. Like, I think we just talked about this in the last episode, because it was our Matt chapters were close to the time that Nynaeve broke her block and married Lan and everything. So in this chapter, Matt shows us to what degree he's accepting his Ta'Viranness, which is something he's been working on. Before, back in like the Shadow Rising, he wouldn't even want to hear that word. He's like, Tom, you can just leave if you're going to keep talking about that. He would also be in complete denial that assassins were after him. Wow, there's a lot of brigands on the streets right now in Tarvalin, you know. And he's been accepting this and noticing these things little by little. Now he's accepting that he's Ta'Viran. The way he thinks about it now, though, is that Ta'Viran should mean things just revolve around what I want. He's not accepting that means things revolve around what the pattern needs me to be. So he had been thinking about, wow, Rand has all the luck with this Ta'Viranness. You know, he can just do whatever he wants. And he's thinking about how, well, actually, this quote says how he's misunderstanding his Ta'Viranness. Quote, limping along, idly eyeing tumblers and jugglers and acrobats at their practice, he wondered how matters had come to this pass. Blood and ashes, he was Ta'Viran. He was supposed to shape the world around him. So he's reflecting, end quote, he's reflecting on how he's stuck in Ebu Dar. Nothing is going his way. He can't even gamble and get a bunch of money right now because Tylan is monitoring his activity so much that she's not going to be letting him build up enough savings to be able to leave and that kind of stuff. And he thinks that everybody else must be having such a better time of it. You know, the grass is always greener for Matt. He's always thinking about not only do Rand and Perrin understand women better, like the boys always say about each other, but that they must be living the high life right now. He imagines Rand just sipping wine, him and Perrin just laughing together in front of a fire, and we know that's not the case. I mean, most recently, between those two, Rand had thrown Perrin across the room and told him to leave town in front of everybody. It's just kind of ridiculous that he's made it to the point that he acknowledges that he is Ta'Viran. He acknowledges some stuff about how his luck works and everything, but he's still misunderstanding it. He's still in denial about what that actually means about it being fate instead of just like, oh, stuff revolves around me and what I want. And he has clues, too, to what Rand and Perrin could be doing. Every time he thinks about him, he gets these colors swirling in his head. And instead of going, what's that? Let me explore that a little bit more. As curious a person as he is, he's like, okay, that's weird. I'm going to completely just put that aside for now. I don't know. He's got the clues to figure out how his Ta'Viranness should be working and what everybody else is up to, and he's just not going to use them right now, just in denial.
Right. Oh, man, so many good points. There's really nothing I can add to that. You have summed that one up so well. But it is a fun Matt chapter. There's not a lot of action going on, other than Eludra getting angry at one
Yeah.
point and waving the pestle in his face, and he's wondering if he could move fast enough because she looks very serious, and even makes a comment about a man will kind of forgive you, but a woman will crack your head over nothing or something. I don't remember exactly how it's worded, but one of those little Matt quotes that I just remembered
Yeah.
the context of it more than the quote itself. Oh, and I do recall when, of course, he let it slip about the other guild members, that the guild is gone pretty much. Most of them are enslaved, and he sees her crying, and this, again, is kind of Matt's one-track mind. Since he had really been trying to do the flirting earlier, he starts thinking, maybe I should put my arm around her, because women like that when they're upset. And
Yeah.
before he even shifts his weight, she knows what he's up to. She's just not going to put up with that for a moment. So, his sense of timing is incredibly bad in that instance. But
Yeah.
still, it's just typical Matt. Yeah.
For sure.
Yeah, not a lot of action, but a lot of things to like in this chapter.
Yeah, it was just really a catch-up chapter, just to kind of remind us, here's what was going on, since you may not have heard from Matt in a couple of years in real world first age time or whatever. So I wasn't expecting to have a lot to pull out of it, but I did like so many of these moments. It was kind of surprising to me, like, oh, there's Matt's lack of self-awareness, there's Matt's slow character growth and being in denial about his role in the pattern and everything. So it sets the stage pretty well for some major changes to be coming into his life soon. Now, we're not really covering any of those this episode, but we're on the cusp of them.
Right. And again, I did notice that we have this period, this is the second time in Ibu Dar, there is a lull in the action. Matt is not needed for a while, and he gets bored.
Yeah.
And Matt, typical man, when he gets bored, he gets stupid. And that's where we kind of find him in these chapters. Now, previously, he went through this until there was action and he was needed, and then he's super Matt again.
Yeah.
But then, we go back to the period of him being bored, not really knowing what to do with himself, not able to do a lot because of his injuries that we kind of get to see in retrospect. Because, as we said, he was not in the entire last book. We go through a Crown of Swords with no Matt whatsoever. So now in Winter's Heart, we kind of pick back up with the story. So yeah, in real life, readers went probably 4 or 5 years with no Matt until they hit this chapter. So people were starving for a little bit of Matt, I think. But, well, I do remember, serious business, when I was buying those books as they came out, wondering, did that wall really finish him? Because I went an entire book without him. So I did have to wonder whether or not he survived it. I wanted him to. I thought he did.
Yeah.
Because, as you know, until you have a body and a funeral or a funeral pyre, they're not really dead. That's
right.
The heroes cannot die like that. But still, I had to start wondering because, hey, this is a long time with no Matt. But anyway, so I digress, which is what we do on this show. So we're now working back through some of his boredom and getting back to the action chapters again. So Matt can begin being better. He can begin being Super Matt Taverin using this again. So.
Yes, and the end of your chapter is setting it up for that to happen very soon. He's having these conversations with everybody else, or with Tom and Beslin, about where he might be needed to help folks and how he doesn't do heroics. So before getting too much into that, I guess I'll let you, if you don't have anything else about chapter 15, do your summary of 16.
All right, be glad to get into it. Thank you. Chapter 16 is entitled An Unexpected Encounter. Matt walks back to the city, thinking of how life had changed very little for most of the people under Seanchan rule here. Trade went on as normal, and as long as everyone swore the 3 oaths, which were to obey the forerunners, await the return, and serve those who come home, and they followed the strict laws, nothing much changed. There were even ships from many countries in the harbor, such as Ilion, Arad, Doman, and Tyr, though most of the seafolk vessels had been confiscated and were being re-rigged in the Seanchan fashion. In fact, there were so many ships in the harbor, Matt thought he could have walked across the bay to the Rahad by stepping from one deck to another. The traffic heading into the city was heavy, and there were many Seanchan among them. Soldiers, nobles of the blood, and wagons filled with Seanchan farmers among them. Matt noticed most of them only to avoid them, still distracted by the sound of dice rattling in his head. He did notice the horses more, but because he always did. The Seanchan had been confiscating 1 in 5 horses in what they call the lottery. That did enrage the traders and travelers, even more than the tar-coated heads of criminals which adorned a platform above the city gates. Tom and Beslin kept their heads together, talking in low tones. Matt was sure that they were plotting something that could land their heads above the gates as well. Once through the gates, Matt stopped. The streets were full. Not the usual busy day full, but overflowing with people. There was nowhere to walk. Then the words "the return" came to Matt's mind, and he realized that the Seanchan were not just conquering cities, they were moving in to stay. Farmers, tradesmen, brewers, printers, Seanchan from all walks of life were pouring into the city in overwhelming numbers, many of them moving through and out again to settle and start a new life here in this land. The sheer number of ships in the harbor now made a lot more sense. Matt put Oliver firmly into Tom's grip to keep the lad from getting lost in the press, then warned Tom and Beslin to take back streets toward the palace. The main thoroughfares were far too crowded to travel. "I just want to walk around a little," Matt lied. Tom and Beslin pressed him for a moment. They both wanted his luck and, quote, a certain flair for the adventurous in aid to their plans, but Matt wanted nothing to do with it. Nope, nada, out of here. There were too many Seanchan. Listen, quote from Matt here. "They are here, Beslin. If you couldn't stop them getting in, you sure as morning you won't be able to push them out. Rand will deal with them." End quote. After a few more words, they left for the palace. Matt wanted a game of dice, but the common rooms of all the inns were just as crowded as the streets. Besides, dressed in his brightly colored clothes, no one took him seriously. Finally, in disgust, he started back to the palace. He took the back alleys to get out of the press, which were all laid out like a maze, just as well that Matt had spent as much time as possible learning them. The alleys were cramped, dark, and smelly, but at least they were easy in which to travel. Almost back to the palace, Matt stepped on something that rolled underfoot, and he fell down in the freezing mud and water. At least he hoped it was water. Suddenly boots landed on his shoulders, and his assailant fell and skidded in the muck himself. It was the golem. Matt gathered himself, threw his walking stick at the thing's legs, trying to trip it up as he pulled his fox-head medallion out. Scrambling, Matt fought back with the medallion, hitting hands, face, whatever he could as the golem pressed the attack. Matt could not hold out for long. Suddenly they were shouting. "He's down this alley," a voice called. "Follow me, hurry, he'll get away." The golem hissed, ran further down the alley, then crawled through a fist-sized hole in the brick of the side of a tavern. "I don't think I've ever seen the like," a voice said. It was an old man with a long dagger and a bundle on his back. He was alone. He had only appeared to call out to others in order to scare off the attacker. "I think maybe you and I have the Dark One's own luck," the man told Matt. Matt was so tired of hearing that, but as the old man offered his hand to Matt, Matt shook it, realized the hand was very gnarled and tough, and the man introduced himself as Noel Charam. He was looking for an alley in which to spend the night. "I think I can do better for you than that," Matt offered Noel, but the dice were still spinning in his head.
So this chapter is a really good setup chapter for some big things to happen next. I mean, there was the action with the golem. You think that would be important enough, him being in mortal danger and whatnot, but to actually move his plot forward a little bit. The last chapter was just a setup, or not setup, more of a check-in. Here's Matt. Remember what it's like to be embodied in his perspective. Here's how, he survived the wall and everything. Here's where he is, who he's with, what he's been up to. This one, it's like, here is a problem. Here, we're about to move into some kind of second act of another Matt arc here. And we introduce some new elements. So we got a new character who comes in to sort of save him from the golem with this distraction. And we've also got these undercurrents of rebellion against the Seanchan going on. So we got a lot to be curious about. First-time readers with just the plot. But as rereaders, we've got a lot to dig into in terms of Matt's character, how he might end up being changed by these new forces or characters that he's going to be around. We also get a lot in this chapter about world building, and I have a lot to say about this. I'm going to try to keep centering it back on Matt's perspective, but it's easy for me to kind of zoom out with a lot of geopolitical stuff in this one. So I think I'm going to take a step back and let you make some points about this chapter before I really dig into that.
Okay, yeah. Not many points that I had to make about this, except this is, it's amazing to me listening to this on audiobooks this time that I am in the slog. It's not the worst parts of it, but I am in the slog because it no longer seems like it to me. I think before, when I was just focused on the story and where it's going, these last two chapters are something that could have been summed up by most authors in just a few paragraphs. But things are drawn out because Robert Jordan is pouring so much detail into this, and it's good detail. It's not just the architecture and things like this that you see with some of the characters, because Matt doesn't pay a lot of attention to that. But it's almost as if peripherally Matt is seeing and taking in all these details that to him are meaningless, yet to the reader, especially a second or third or multiple times through the story, they're very rich, in-depth details. We see the entire Seanchan mindset here. They're not just conquerors. They're not just people who want to come in and conquer. They consider themselves people who are coming home. They're coming to a home they've not seen and have only heard about in stories that are 1,000 years old. Yet they're considering themselves coming home. They're bringing what they consider their superior culture and way of life to these barbaric lands, and they're colonizers. They're not just they're not just antagonists. They're not just wanting to come in and defeat the others militarily. They're colonizers. So I very much am mindful of when Europeans came to America, for instance. And I know many people have colonized many different areas of the world. So I'm sure we have listeners from other countries that you can just kind of insert, twist, put your history into there. But being Americans, we think of that. The colonization of America took much longer. We did not have the sheer numbers. We did not have wielders of the one power who were collared and controlled. But you see this, how they were coming in to stay, and at that point you can't really root them out. And Matt perceives this very quickly, that hey, if they can come in as easily as they came in, you're not just going to push them out of the city. That's not their goal. Their goal is not to take over the capitals of these cities. Their goals are to set up a place to live. So Matt absorbs this very quickly, and he takes in those details very quickly. As well, just hearing a few whispers from Tom and Beslin, he knows they're cooking up something. They're and it's no good. It's not going to work, and they have not tried to talk him into it. I think this is Tom and Deus Demar. If they try to talk Matt into something like this, they know he's out. He will have nothing to do with it. He will be as far away from it as possible. But they keep talking about it amongst themselves until he's intrigued enough to ask about it. Now, he still wants nothing to do with it. But Tom even talked about how, you're one who loves to take risks, and we could use you in this. Right. And Matt's thoughts, quote, "What did Tom mean? He never took risks unless they were forced on him." End quote.
Okay.
And I'm thinking the like the first time you met Eludra, when you swung down on the rope and knocked these four guys on the ground, and then looked around and you're standing there with no weapon and they've got knives. You never take risks, Matt. It's just, unless they're forced on you. That's just not something you do. And of course, I have my tongue firmly in cheek to say that. So, but I still think that's very game of houses, Tom, who is, just a master at it, to not mention any of these things to Matt until Matt asks. Because he understands Matt enough to know you don't come to him with a plan. You let him come to you with a plan, but you let him hear enough, see you whispering enough and drop enough breadcrumbs for him to follow, that he knows that you're cooking up something. And then he's going to step in and he's going to improve it. He's going to make it completely different. And everything's going to change because he's Taveran. But that at least is Tom and Beslin's goal. But luckily, Matt is intelligent enough. He does not want to have anything to do with it, and he doesn't. He doesn't step in and take over. He doesn't get pulled into their plans. This is one he steers as far away from as possible. Now, he does use Beslin in a few chapters. We'll see that. But, he does not get involved in any of that. One thing, and I meant to mention this earlier when I talked about the Seanchan and their colonization. The Seanchan are very brutal. We see they are are people who not only have a very strict caste system, multi-layered caste system in their society, but they also, they keep slaves. They think nothing of that. We see a lot of dehumanization
Yeah.
with them. And again, that's one of those things most anybody from any part of the world can look at their history and see examples of that. You know, we in America, there are a lot of things going on right now, a lot of turmoil in society that have gone on because of the dehumanization of certain people in the past, and from some people's point of view, to some degree, maybe even into the present. But in every society, there are people who have dehumanized others. You can go back and at any time people take other groups of people and they feel like we're people, we're human, and they're not. Even go back to the American Indian, and of course, in real life, you and I have some Cherokee Indian ancestry. And the Cherokee were one of the more peaceful tribes of American Indians. They did not get involved in wars very often. They were more agrarian in their society. Yet just their name for themselves, Salagi, which is the name for their people, that means the real people or the true people, because they had the view that anyone who was not Cherokee was not the true people. They were not real people. So even in more agrarian and peaceful societies, you had dehumanization of other people, and that's what leads to things like slavery and just some brutality that takes place in a lot of warfare. So we see that in the Seanchan here. But one thing I do admire about the Seanchan is their legal system. Their legal system appears to be as fair as they can make it. Because out of the dozen or so heads that are stuck up on this platform up above the city gates, 3 of them were Seanchan heads. They had signs there telling what each one of them did. If you broke the law, it didn't matter who you were, you would face justice or face their penalties, whether or not it's justice. I guess it could be argued that was a poor choice of words on my part, but you face retribution in their judicial system. So and it didn't matter, even if you were one of the blood, if you broke the law, if you broke one bad enough, you could be killed. Now, you would not be beheaded. They had things that were a little more honorable for the blood, but they would just strangle you to death. But so it's one of those things. Even in a terrible society, you can find good elements in it, in the fact that they did not have people going hungry. They made sure people were fed. They made sure people who could work did work. Now, of course, sometimes that was enforced and sometimes that was brutal. I'm not saying those things are good, but it's things where at least they were trying to build a structured society where a lot of this chaos and lawlessness that you see, especially at Ibu Dar and some of the rougher quarters like the Rahad, those things just didn't take place. You had peace and stability. Again, it was at the cost of freedom, and it was at the cost of personal liberty, and at the cost of treating some people as being human beings. So I don't think it was worth that cost, but there were still some elements. If you could take their society and change it, and of course it's our secret hope that Matt works with Tuan in the future to shape and change things about the Seanchan society, you could see where it could be changed into something good or something much better, at least.
Yeah.
I didn't really have a point to that, but it's just some things I saw
I
that
mean,
I
I think
ran
those are
with.
really great points, and they mirror so much of what I already have in my notes that I was gonna just go on this long rant about, but I'm glad you're already bringing these points in and planting these seeds, because most of what I had to talk about with this chapter is how the Seanchan colonize, and I think you rightly brought up that you could find parallels between them and any empire, any colonizing force throughout history. There's going to be some parallels here, because to a degree, any empire functions by dehumanizing some. That is the cost that they have built in to bring about these benefits, supposed benefits, to the people that they already have as the upper classes in the empire, and the new people that they try to absorb into that imperial identity. And we see both of those things happening here. So we see that they have publicly normalized a lot of gruesome violence. And once you do this with very heavy-handed displays of their justice system, their legal system, once you have these very public displays of bodies and heads being displayed right at the gate for everybody to walk around, that's a huge deterrent to anybody resisting, obviously, but it also makes all that type of gruesomeness very commonplace and normal, so that people, the just kind of everyday people going about their lives in the way that Matt and everybody else seem to be doing here, as long as they're not part of the expendable class, right, they can kind of become immune and desensitized to seeing these things all the time, and they're not going to see the Seanchan as quite so evil anymore, because they're not the ones directly being hurt. As long as they're on the right side of the law, they're going to be okay. So that's one of the ways that the Seanchan can operate, just by normalizing certain amounts of violence that are kind of built into the system. And, I mean, we see just how banal this evil is, how normal it is, because Matt barely makes a note of it at all. He's like, yeah, he'd gotten so used to just walking under this gate that he barely noticed. Oliver was singing as he walked under it. You can see just how easy it is for a child to become adapted and normalized to seeing gruesome displays. And that's one way, as an empire, you could easily gain control. Once that next generation grows up, they're not going to question anything like that. They're not going to think it's gross and bad. Especially, imagine if a kid like Oliver were not aligned with one of our main characters. He has lost his parents to war and disease that these, more orderly forces in society, the Seanchan, could have prevented. You could imagine how he could get kind of indoctrinated into willingly being a part of this empire. And that's the second way that the Seanchan colonize, is that they colonize the mind as well. And any imperial force does this by saying, you can be included in this too, as long as you are with us in treating the expendable class as expendable, and you don't question that stuff, and you don't question the bodies hanging up and everything. Here's all the benefits you get from it, and then you end up being on board with it. So Matt sort of gets the seeds here of realizing why those things are going to be so difficult to fight, because it's a structural violence. If you imagine that kid like Oliver growing up in this empire, just by virtue of being in that society and being a law-abiding person in that society, he's sort of participating in it. He is gaining benefits from channelers being collared or other people being treated as property. If he's not, he's gaining the riches from better trade or whatever, if he's living with somebody who like a merchant or something like that.
It's like you have a vested interest in continuing that way of life and making it go on
absolutely.
just as before.
So
I'd never seen
even
that
if
before.
Oliver were never to do any violence against any of those people himself, he doesn't own a Damane, he doesn't own a Daco Vale, he doesn't treat any people like property specifically, he is probably not going to shake up that structure. So it's a structural and systemic violence that's extremely difficult to fight, because it's being maintained by a lot of people who individually aren't doing something directly to another person that's violent, but they're still a part of this like violent system. And Matt is astute enough to figure out that you can't do this with just battle tactics. You can't fight this. He doesn't have stuff in his battle memories that are going to help him with this. They're not going to serve him here. So he's figuring out, how could people fight this tide of people? Because most of the Seanchan here are just regular folks going about their lives. They're just civilians, small business owners and stuff, women and children. And this concept is demonstrated very well visually too, because as he's thinking about this, they're having to fight through a very large crowd of people. And the description is, quote, "The streets of Ebudar were always full of people, but not like this, as though a dam had burst and sent a flood of humanity into the city," end quote. And he recognizes that there's no putting the water back behind a burst dam. It makes sense now to me more, as I've been breaking this down, why the Seanchan as a problem are still around by the end of the series, and why Matt and Tuon's future adventures together was one of the follow-up sequel novels that Robert Jordan had considered, because that is an ongoing problem that could be a whole series in itself. How do you fight an empire? Now, the empire did lose a lot of their power because they have crumbled on the Seanchan continent, so there is kind of a vacuum for some kind of new system to take its place. It kind of already has been burnt to the ground in a way. But yeah, I just think it's interesting that Matt he's seeing all this going on with the Seanchan. He's not thinking quite as deeply about it as I think you and I did, because we have the benefit of learning so much history about so many different empires and we know how this works. But
Right.
so
Yes.
Matt is very dismissive in thinking Rand will deal with it. Well, how in the world is Rand supposed to deal with this? There's nothing he can do about all these people just moving in and setting up their lives here and believing the Seanchan Empire once they start receiving these benefits at the expense of the expendable classes in it. So yeah, I would love thinking about how Matt would help to dismantle that someday once he's with Tuon, if he becomes a little more involved in the politics of the Seanchan Empire.
Because one of the things that RJ nailed so perfectly in this is the feeling of superiority of the colonizing force, or of the empirical force.
Yeah.
I said empirical. I should mean imperial. I'm sorry. I know better than that.
Yeah.
It just, my mouth stumbled over it. But anyway, of the imperial force, they have such a feeling of superiority. It's like they learn a little bit about the customs of the people of Ibu Dar. Of course, they leave the ruler, Thailand, in place to give some normalcy, but they never even think about learning or adapting any of the customs of Ibu Dar, because their way and their customs and everything is far superior. So, you're just going to have to adapt
just
to us.
unquestioned better. Yeah.
Right. Never stopping to consider, is there something we can learn from these people that would better us? Because the Seanchan have this such a superiority complex that their way is always the way, it's the best way, and everybody adapts. That's also one of their big weaknesses, though, because they don't adapt well to new situations. They don't adapt well, although they do, like, to many of the fighting tactics, and Rand finds this out when he goes to try to destroy and stop them from leaving certain areas and trying to bottle them up in these mountain passes. And he finds out they've got enough people that they took that defeat, they learned from it, and they kind of kept marching on. But as a society, they don't adapt. They may do it militarily, but as a society, they don't adapt to things very well.
The first Forerunners, they didn't even acknowledge that they had ever happened. That happened at the end of the Great Hunt, right? So they have tried this return before to try to pave the way for the return, and it didn't work out. And they have just, instead of trying to learn from the mistakes and adapt to whatever is going on here on the mainland of Randland, instead they have just decided to wipe that from their minds and acknowledge that the ever victorious army is still ever victorious. They've still never lost anything. And that is a main weakness, like you said. You can see that with any influential empire. Nowadays we call them superpowers, but they're still pretty much empires. So any superpower or empire has this myth about themselves that they're the best. That's part of what they colonize with, as we've been over. And that's their weakness, because when things start to go wrong in the empire, you don't have a way of acknowledging that. Because if you believe that insert society here is the best, you still just believe, well, we'll get through it because we're number one, we're the best. You don't have to think about any strategies of how would you make sure that these people's needs are better met so that they're not becoming a problem. How would you solve any political problem here? Insert any problem a society could have. So I think that the Seanchan are definitely vulnerable to that as well. They think of themselves as invincible, and that's a huge blind spot.
And in fact, one of the things that caused the collapse of their empire is the very fact that they intentionally pit members of the royal family against one another. Tuon has these thoughts. Of course, they're not in these chapters. They're, I think, a little later on, but Tuon has these thoughts about how her brothers and sisters have tried to kill her, cousins, different people of the imperial family. She's been a target since the very day she was born. And they do that so that only the strongest survive. Well, that's not really true. What you get is the most devious, the most wicked survive. People who are willing to do anything can survive. And so they put their own personal benefits ahead of that of the empire. And even though they all claim they're completely, totally loyal to the throne, just like many people, they're completely, totally loyal to themselves. And you get a decay of sorts because they are so amoral, because they are so vindictive. That decay causes a civil war back home and an entire collapse of the empire, at least back home. So yeah, the ones that are here in Randland, they're here to stay at that point because they really have very little else to go back to. So yeah, I wonder if that's some of the things that Matt can teach them to take. Hey, let's take these good ideas here, A, B, C, D, and get rid of these bad ideas here. Cut those out and trim those away, and see if we
Yeah.
can make a society that is a little more fair. And if there is still any Tavarian nature to him after the last battle and after things are over with, then I think that could have potentially made a
Yeah.
great follow-up sequel. Or even if you just go a generation or two ahead with Matt and Tuon's children, I think there could have been some awesome things there, because I could see him getting involved in that. You think of the history and the historical perspective that he has, how many civilizations that he can think of, and kingdoms that have risen and
Yeah.
fallen, and what did work and did not work. He unintentionally is a walking historical encyclopedia of knowledge, of
Yeah.
practical knowledge, not just military knowledge. So yeah, if anyone could help change the Seanchan Empire completely, it is our boy Matt, as long as he's married to the daughter of the Nine Moons, which of course we know is one of those things that's upcoming. Totally off topic, because I can't help it, it just popped in my head. Would Matt and Tuon have ever gotten together if that prophecy had not been told to him by the Eelfin?
No, I don't think so. It's interesting trying to think about that. It's sort of one of those like time travel paradox things, because would that part of the pattern have been there if they had not read it that way, or however it is that they have access to? Yeah, that's.
And we've talked about that with Matt and his three wives.
Rand, you said Matt.
I'm sorry, I apologize. Yeah. We've talked about that with Rand and his three wives, and how that probably would not have happened if men had not had that viewing. But there are other things in here as well that just the fact that the Aelfin, I think I said Aelfin before, but the Aelfin said it, made it happen rather than just predicting what would happen. They set the events in motion to create
same
it.
on
So
her end too,
self-fulfilling
because
prophecy.
Tuon had a reading from a Damane who gave a foretelling. Apparently that's a lot more common for Damane to do than for Aes Sedai, or it's known that a Damane can read your fortune. So they each had a prophecy about each other and recognized it when they came into contact with each other. Oh, this is the one. So that's why she was she could have resisted him more than she did, because we see what a competent martial artist she is. And I think at some point she realizes when he yells, "This is my wife," 3 times. Oh, okay. I see what's going on here.
Right. So yeah, and we're going to get a lot more in depth in that.
Yeah,
in
we're really jumping
episodes,
the gun here. But
yes, those are just such fun things to visit. But yeah, in my mind, we kind of have 2 different things going on within the predicting outcomes or predicting futures in Randland. And one of those is like the accident with the portal stone.
Oh yeah.
Where they see all these possible future timelines, what could have been. That's like one set of things. It's over here on the side. Moiraine and all of the wise ones who go into Rodion have something similar when they enter the Throngraal.
Specifically
all these possible
is
futures.
Very interesting. And
yes,
raises questions about how set in stone is that. Oh no, I really hope this doesn't happen to the Aiel, and all of that.
Right. So yeah, you have those possible branching futures, and you kind of try to work your way through those. And then you have outright prophecy, some of it in the Carathian cycle, some of it from the Aelfin, maybe some other sources, some foretellings that they don't tell what's going to happen, but they put events in motion to make them happen. And in my mind, I almost see that as the creator reaching down to tweak a few things here and there, saying, okay, let's just do this. Now, people may differ. That's just my personal headcanon. You may just see it as the impersonal weaving of the wheel, trying to get the pattern like you want it. But whatever way, there's some agency that's causing it to happen by stating the prophecy, which otherwise it would never have even happened. So it's one of those little mind-bending things I think about sometimes when I have too much time on my hands. Thank you, coronavirus. We all have too much time now.
Yeah. I think I've run out of thoughts on this chapter. It's cool that we were both on the same page and mostly just focusing on how empires work and how colonizing works and what they're
Yeah.
up against here.
Yeah.
Because I think I didn't focus a whole lot on that my first time through. So I'm just interested in seeing more about
No.
how it plays out and how Matt becomes involved as a hero. Or involved in
Right.
this resistance at all. Now, I actually don't remember very well because in my reread, I'm not up to this point yet. I'm still very, very early in Path of Daggers. That's a very thick book, and I have a bunch of other things I'm reading right now.
Okay. Right.
So I actually don't remember. It seems like just because he's being in such denial about it, that he is going to help out the resistance. I mean, and it's foreshadowed that he's going to be doing that by hurling fireworks at them. So I know about the dragons and everything, but I really just don't remember enough about how this plays out and how the Empire gets resisted and where they're really left by the end of it. I know that they're kind of unresolved, but I don't remember to what degree and where on the Randland continent and everything.
Right. As far as Beslin's involvement in trying to get them out of Ibudar, I think that's pretty much over. Now there may be some other things because I'm only about a third of the way into Winter's Heart.
Yeah.
But pretty much when they're wanting to leave that night, they're wanting to sneak out of Ibudar. It's like, okay, you go have some of your boys set fire at the granaries. You be sitting in an inn where everybody can see you, get roaring drunk, so you have this perfect alibi. You were across town from where it happened, and just we just want a distraction. We don't want a war. So, but now, if there's something that happens later, I've probably forgotten it from my first read through. But that's all I'm aware of at this time. They're in Ibudar concerning Teslin is just that one fact. Hey, let's use Teslin as a distraction, and let's get out of here. Now, one little thing I had forgotten from my first time through the story, how quickly Noel was brought into the series.
Oh, yeah.
In my mind, I thought he came in much later. I thought this was like a Brandon Sanderson thing. I really did not realize he was brought into the story at this point. So we're a little over halfway through the entire series, and here's Noel who bebops up. One thing I never thought of before until today when I was looking at it, Noel is another one of those characters who's very, very like Matt. He sees something happen in the alley. He can see a man being attacked, doesn't know the situation, and he just reacts. He doesn't react by rushing in. He reacts by yelling, hey, yeah, he's down here. I just saw him. Y'all come, hurry. They'll get away. He doesn't have a clue what's going on, but he knows one of those guys is probably a bad guy, and the bad guy's going to run away if he thinks a whole group of armed men are rushing in there toward him. So it's like Noel's thought process is a lot like Matt's. Oh, this is what I'm doing because I'm already doing it. He finds out what his next step is halfway through it. And there are different times like that. You see that with Noel. You see at times when he perceives what's going on or what other people are, not really what they're thinking, like as far as reading minds, but as far as reading the person, he kind of knows what they're going to do or has a general idea. So he's very good at reading people just like Matt is. And of course he has a wandering heart. He's traveled most of the known world and some of the unknown places of the world, and but he didn't do it to bring glory to himself. He just there's always greener grass on the other side of the fence, so he's got to go see what that's like. So he's very, very like an older version of Matt.
Oh yeah,
and I do
which
like
is
that
why
about
it's so
him.
hilarious that Matt's never actually read the book.
Right.
There's all these clues. He's come so close to it. He started reading it once in the palace back in Crown of Swords.
Yes.
So he was so bored, and then he put it down. He's even thought about it, like, oh yeah, random pair needs to talk about that book. I guess I'll get around to it someday, but I'm just never really one for reading a whole lot.
Right.
Yeah, it is funny how similar they are. I think part of Noel's impulsiveness might be his compulsion. He does have some at some point. He has done some evil things before, and that's why. And I feel comfortable saying this because we already covered it in our season 1, and we have big spoiler warnings anyway. But when he sacrifices himself during the Moiraine rescue mission, and he says, "You tell him Jane Farstrider died clean." He has done some dark stuff in the past, and he was under compulsion. And I think he knew he had talked to Matt previously anyway, outside of Jacob Carradine's hideout, or what, not hideout, but where he was staying in Ebudar.
Was that who that? Oh, so I knew the old man talked to him, but I didn't know that was just Noel.
I think it was, yeah. So I
Oh,
think
yeah.
at that point he was supposed to follow Matt and do something. He has orders about Matt, and maybe that's why he was
Mm,
close to him while the Golem was with him here in the scene anyway. But it seems like without any outside intervention, Noel has been able to break through his compulsion, much in the same way that Morghese did. As soon as she got away from Ravine long enough, she was able to kind of get
right.
a clear head and know something isn't right, and go try to escape or go do something about her situation. And I think Noel ends up the same, because once we see that he's attached to Matt's story, he's not really sabotaging anything anymore. But
Right.
I think it's not just his compulsion that makes him impulsive. I think it is he does have this, wanderlust. He is kind of an impulsive, easily bored person, probably. So, but I'd never thought about him and Matt being so similar before. That's funny.
It's, I could just see, an old Matt being very much like him,
Yeah.
if Matt lives to be old. So sort of one of those things like back in the, I think, 90s, early 2000s, there was the show that came out, the Young Indiana Jones Chronicles.
Oh.
And, at the first of every show, of course, it was Indiana Jones as a teenager,
Mm-hmm.
but the first of every show, there was this old one-eyed man that was Indiana Jones as an old man. And so
Oh.
he's kind of like starts narrating it, and then it
Yeah.
takes you into the young actor, going into the story. And it always bothered me in some way because, okay, he's not going to die. He's going to survive through
Yeah.
whatever other movies they make. But I kind of see that like a Matt, this old one-eyed man who's traveled the whole world and seen everything. I was married to an empress one time, and then start telling you these stories and take you back
Yeah.
into what's going on. So I could just see those kind of funny parallels there. Somebody who's gone everywhere and seen everything just because they had that wandering, adventurous nature and they could never put down roots. So yeah, I see a lot of Matt in Noel or vice versa. Um,
Mm-hmm.
my first time through the series, when it was revealed that he was Jane Farstrider, I'm I kind of had the picture that the stories from Jane Farstrider were from hundreds of years before, and so he was some kind of
Oh yeah,
supernatural
same. That's
person.
why I was shocked by it being him. There were a lot of
Right.
clues towards the end, like before
Yes.
he
Yes.
reveals his identity. But yeah, I thought that book was way, way older. So I was like, "Are you kidding me? What is he, a channeler or something?" Like,
Right.
and then I just finally had to come to terms with, oh, I guess the book is not as old as I thought.
Right. Right. It was just very popular, and they
Yeah.
had printing presses, so they could print a lot of books and
Right.
distribute them. So yeah, it's funny that there are even copies of that book in the Two Rivers in Emmons Field.
Mm-hmm.
Noel, he was an old man, but that I would say that book had probably been published 20, 30, 40 years before, so he was still
Mm.
relatively young when it was published, I imagine. But maybe that's how he
Yeah.
financed more of his travels and was able to travel more of the world. We don't know, but I do like that part of the story. To me, it just seemed like one of those things that was thrown in at the end the first time through. But
Mm.
as I've said,
Yeah.
there were so many things. And there's so many things I thought were just thrown into the story haphazardly that have so much foreshadowing, have so much build up, but this story just has such incredible, immense detail that it's easy to miss so many of those things until you're going back through it again.
Right. It's so expansive that you can get lost in which details are going to be
Yes,
important
yes,
later and everything.
exactly. Oh, so that's all I've got. Man, this has been a fun episode. I hope it has been for our listeners as
Yeah, it
well.
really has.
Please join us next week for episode 23, where we look into chapters 17 and 18 of Winter's Heart, which is the halfway mark through our season 2. That means there's a lot more
Oh,
Matrim
wow.
Cawthon to enjoy, folks.
Awesome. I didn't quite realize that the math worked out that way. That's cool. Subscribe to Wheel of Mind on Podbean, Stitcher, Google Play, Apple, Spotify, or YouTube. And that last one is under the name Lajara Dane, Lajaradayne, to get notified when a new episode drops every Wednesday. Leave us some feedback by rating and reviewing on whatever you use to listen to us, or by contacting my email at lajaradane@gmail.com. I could also pass along any messages to Giskel. He's not quite as very online as I am. You could reach me on Twitter or the podcast account is @mind_wheel. And then my personal Twitter is @Lajarasedai. So that's LAJARASEDAI. This is not the ending, but it is an ending to the turning of the Wheel of Mind.
Very good. And remember, all you folks, when life gets tough, don't sweat the petty things. And don't pet the sweaty things.
I have been because I don't have enough things to do, I started this thing called National Novel Writing Month.
Oh,
It's like hashtag NaNoWriMo. If you see that
okay.
anywhere on anything, it comes around usually in April and July. And I don't have an idea for a novel right away, but I've just been thinking since I've been doing all this reading. I've read, as of today, 129 books in 2020 so far. I've been thinking so much about what I like in books, what I don't like, and I've been curious to start writing a little bit myself. I haven't done that creatively since, really for fun, not since like middle school,
Right.
like when I was writing Star Wars fan fiction and stuff,
Yes.
and then the occasional creative writing assignments in high school or college, but not anything for myself. So I just started this and started kind of just discovery writing, stream of consciousness about, and seeing what popped up that I might be interested in using. And then I've started following this. It's just a WordPress blog where a creative writing instructor has put some getting started writing short stories prompts and little reading assignments and stuff out there. And then on top of that, I have been listening to Brandon Sanderson's lectures on YouTube because he teaches at BYU. He still teaches one class a year about writing science fiction and fantasy. And I don't know if you've ever listened to any of his lectures.
No, I haven't. I need to, but I haven't.
Yeah. So there's a series from every year, but I've just started with the 2020 ones. And even if I don't go anywhere with writing, just listening to him talk about it, I understand how stories are structured so much better. And I feel like I understand so much more about what writers are trying to do when I read their stories and how they're accomplishing that, and figuring out more of how to name what I like or what I don't like. And it's just really instructive because once you see him give so many examples about his own writing and popular pop culture writing like Star Wars and stuff like that, you can understand so much about why his plots are really compelling and everything. He gives you all the little mechanics and the tools that he uses about how to foreshadow things and how to pay it off. So I just had a really good week starting that on the 1st, and listening to one of those lectures a day, trying to write around 1,500 words every day and following along these little prompts and everything. And I don't know what I'm going to have by the end of it. Like the National Novel Writing Month end goal is to have 50,000 words and that be like a novel length. And now you've got a draft you can send to an editor or something. Now for me, that's not the case. I didn't have a novel idea to start with, but I hope to have 50,000 words of something that I might, decide what I could do to explore that with, or learn how to write some short stories or something. Yeah. So
that is neat.
I know you used to write a long time ago.
I did.
And I just thought that you might be interested in some of that if you were ever curious about trying again, or just Sanderson's lectures are fun even if you don't write.
Yeah, if I spent any time with that at all, I would get caught up in it, I'm sure.
Yeah.
Because I love trying to write, and it really hurt me to spend a year and a half on one novel and finally just realized I'm just not good at this. And I think most of it is, I had the creativity. I love science fiction and fantasy, particularly fantasy. And I had some pretty good general ideas, but I didn't understand the mechanics of building a story. I really didn't understand the thing of the author knowing that character inside and out before they put them on paper. So my characters would change as the story went, and I could never bring it together. So, I knew where I was going with the story, where I wanted to go with the story, but I couldn't get it there. And since the characters would just kind of change, I guess as my mood changed or as my thoughts on the story changed, it just was not good. But I did have the discipline at that time. I was up at 4:30 every morning. I would spend an hour and a half to 2 hours at the computer writing. I mean, fingertips on the keys writing. And I still have all of that material. I've saved it all these years. It's on the computer, and I've got backup copies. So as we bought new computers, I keep transposing or copying over onto the new computer, so I keep copies of it. But some of my short stories I still like. I may go back and read some of those occasionally. I could never get any of those published. But it was fun, and I enjoyed it. And I think, if I did take some of those classes or listen to some lectures like that, I could get a lot better and maybe even be able to publish a book. It would never be Wheel of Time worthy, but I think I could publish a book, a story. But I don't know, I've got some ideas that I think are really fun ideas, and things I would
Mm-hmm.
love to tell about the characters, but um, I'm just not really to where I can do that now, and
Oh
probably at this
yeah.
point in my life never will be. I mean, that could always change. You never know when your situation in life changes.
Yeah.
But yeah, if things changed enough where I could devote the time and energy to doing it right, I wouldn't mind trying it again. But I don't want to give a half-hearted
Mm-hmm.
stab and create more
Yeah.
disappointment for myself with with not investing myself in it
Oh.
correctly. So
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. And so many of the barriers you've talked about that you had to it are things that um, Sanderson is so cool about addressing for a
right,
lot of
right,
people who he just seems like such a stand-up guy all around. Everything I hear
yeah,
about him, he just seems so generous and nice, but he spends so much of the first lecture of those classes talking about how he's not really that concerned with talents. Like if anybody spent the time learning how to do these things, they could do it. It's a skill like anything
yeah,
else, and you need to spend time grinding at those skills. And I don't know that I have any. I'm not trying to get attached to any kind of big outcome on this because, like you said, you don't want to get very invested and then it not go anywhere. And I think he tries to help prepare people for those feelings. Like, okay, you're probably not going to be the next big thing, but you could get published to make some money out of it. Here's the stats on about how many people do after taking
right,
my
right.
classes, and that was kind of cool. Knowing it's more than like 1 in a million
Yes, yes,
chance is
yeah,
a little encouraging. But either way, I'm just thinking, I'm just having fun organizing my thoughts in different ways about what I like about stories, and if this never goes anywhere, I might could still learn more about what I like in fiction and why I like it. So who knows if this will last a month? I usually pick up a new hobby that lasts about 3 weeks and then it all just kind of falls apart after a while. So we'll
yeah.
see. This has been the most sustainable one in a long time, is this podcast. So I'm excited that we have been doing this since September 2019 and we're now in July and going strong. So
Yeah, but that's cool. I like experimenting with that and looking at it. There we go. I was trying to pull up the name of an author that I've read, but yeah, there were different people that were, I guess, influencing for me and helpful for me back in the day,
mm-hmm.
20 some odd years ago when I tried to write a novel.
Yeah.
And Orson Scott Card was one of those. He had some books on how to write because
Yeah.
back then you didn't have web pages and blogs and
Yeah.
videos and things like this you could watch online, and they were helpful, but I still didn't have the mechanics. To me, you should just be able to sit down and write